Amendment maintain standards of prevailing wage for our workers and ensure that they too have the opportunity to achieve the American dream. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Iowa. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Iowa.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman from request recorded vote pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18. Further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Iowa will be postponed.
We're going to vote now, sir, as soon as I get this done.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 4 by Ms. McCollum of Minnesota. Amendment number 2 by Mr. Kingston of Georgia. An amendment by Mr. Quigley of Illinois. The First Amendment by Mr. Cohen of Tennessee. An amendment by Mr. Pompeo of Kansas. An amendment by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts. An amendment by Mr. Amash of Michigan. The Second Amendment by Mr. Cohen of Tennessee. An amendment by Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island. The First Amendment by Ms. Woolsey of California. An amendment by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts. The Second Amendment by Ms. Woolsey of California. The Third Amendment by Ms. Woolsey of California. The Second Amendment by Ms. Lee of California. An amendment by Mr. King of Iowa. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the time for any electronic vote after the first series of votes. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment number 4, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. McCollum, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Ms. McCollum of Minnesota.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
Members are voting on 15 amendments tonight to the Defense Department spending bill for the next budget year. The over $607 billion bill increases defense spending more than the President requested and more than the budget gap agreed to last year. This 15-minute vote, was offered by Minnesota Democrat Betty McCollum, and this amendment would cut funding used for military bands. Later in this evening, Georgia Republican Jack Kingston will also proposing a $72 million cut in spending for the Pentagon's sponsorship of sports activities such as NASCAR and mixed martial arts. There was a lot of debate on this subject today, and we're going to run some of that for you right now.
Madam Chair, I offer this amendment with Ms. McCollum from Minnesota today. In fact, it was her amendment from last year that got me involved in this. And basically what this does is stops the Defense Department from using major sports sponsorships such as NASCAR motorsports and bass fishing for a recruitment tool which is no longer necessary. And there are a number of reasons for this. Number one, it's not effective. May 18, 2010, Major Brian Creech said in the USA Today that the National Guard spending $26.5 million to sponsor NASCAR got 24,800 inquiries. Of those, they got 20 potential recruits. Of those, what did they get for the $26 million? Not one single recruit. I want to say again, $26 million, 24,000 inquiries, zero recruits. It's not effective. Now, the National Guard support group has been going around with this document saying, oh yes, but look at all the images that we get. Well, again, out of this, according to their own document, they got 40 recruits. So for the money, if you do the math, that's $721,000 per recruit. And why is that? Well, perhaps because the demographic of NASCAR is that 69% of the people are over 35. So when they go and they're pushing their brand or advertising at NASCAR, nearly 70% of the people aren't eligible. That's not their target group. The RAND Corporation in 2000 studied recruitment and said if you want to increase recruitment, then you have to increase the number of recruiters, period. That was the number one thing. That's why on July 10th, the Army dropped out of it, and they said, and I quote, although it's a beneficial endeavor for us, it is rather expensive, and we decided we could repropose that investment into other programs. So when Ms. McCollum actually originally offered this, it was an $80 million reduction into the savings account, but since the Army dropped it, now we're offering a $72 million. Secondly, very, very important for us to remember that the military is reducing its size now, not because of sequestration, before sequestration. They're dropping the number of troops in the Army and the Marine by 103,000 alone. The Defense Department's recruiter has said that the recruitment is high right now because of the economy. Now, number three, this program has no accountability. In February, our office, as a member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, we asked the Pentagon, what are your hard numbers? If you're spending $72 million sponsoring major sports programs, what are you getting out of it? And they couldn't come up with it. Now that disturbs me as a fiscal conservative because I want to believe that if the Pentagon is spending that much money on something, they're able to defend it. The Miller Beer Company actually put it this way. They said on exposure, I don't care how much exposure you get, what it's supposed to be worth, or what our awareness versus the competition is, I need to be able to tell the CEO and our shareholders how many additional cases of beer that I sold. In short, the Army can't tell us how many recruiters they really do get from this. Now, number four, we got sequestration facing us. On top of a $487 billion defense cut over the next 10 years, plus a troop reduction of over 100,000, already we may have additional cuts. And Secretary Panetta has said we need to work together to find better ways to spend the money and stretch our dollars. You know, I'm as pro-military as I get. I'm proud to say I believe the 1st District of Georgia has as much military as any district in the country. I have 4 major military installations, 2 Guard facilities. We have every branch of the military. We have a bombing range in there. And the only thing that is a bigger population than my military are my NASCAR fans. And yet they're saying to me, we're pro-NASCAR, but we realize the situation in America today. For every dollar we spend, 40 cents is borrowed. We can spend this money a lot better than we are today. And again, look what we're spending per recruit according to the National Guard document, which they provided our office. At least they did provide us with an a document, which we did not get from the Pentagon, but it is still costing us over $700,000 per recruit from their own documentation. We can do better than this, and that's why Ms. McCollum and I have worked together, reached across aisles to say we can spend this money elsewhere more effectively, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Wait a minute. He's still on his amendment. We haven't voted excuse on
Mr. Chair.
Withdraw.
Gentleman withdraws. Gentleman from North Carolina?
I rise in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized.
Madam Chair, thank you so much, and I certainly appreciate my colleague, Ms. McCollum and Mr. Kingston, and what they're trying to achieve. And I certainly support paring down the budget where it is appropriate and where it actually saves money. My colleague references some numbers that come from the Army. The Army is getting out of this type of sponsorship. The numbers that I want to give you are from the National Guard that intends to stay in this form of advertising for recruiting purposes and also for building goodwill among the American people. This sponsorship program that the National Guard has in one form, one very specific form of sponsorship that they have, as well as a number of others, but this one form of sponsorship for NASCAR, the National Guard saw a nearly 300% return on their investment. Now, that comes from $68 million of media exposure. It comes from 5.5 million pieces of merchandise and apparel that has National Guard on it, which has a value of roughly $70 million. This is a huge return for the buck. This is why Fortune 500 companies actually advertise through NASCAR, not because it feels good, but because it delivers results. And the fact is that no matter the size of the military, you're going to still need recruits. And the fact remains, if we look at the example of 2005, where the Army didn't meet their recruiting goals, what we had to do is increase the budget for retention. So the facts of cutting one area of recruiting means that in a couple of years we'll have to actually pay more for retention in order to keep in the same folks in the National Guard that we currently need. Furthermore, back to this one particular form of advertising. I think it's highly inappropriate for this Congress to get into the business of specifying how best the National Guard or whatever branch should spend their dollars on recruiting. The Appropriations Committee has done a yeoman's task of making sure that we scrub the Department of Defense budget from top to bottom. I think this is a very strong and good appropriations bill. It does have bipartisan support. But let's face it, when we start micromanaging advertising programs that try to recruit National Guard members, we've sort of slipped into the absurd. The National Guard, from the experience that they've had in NASCAR advertising in particular, they generated 54,000 leads. I wish my colleague had referenced that other than these other numbers that he referenced before, which I think are a good reason why the Army's not continuing with that program. They didn't design it appropriately, apparently. But the National Guard has gotten a huge bang for the buck and has actually gotten recruits because of this form of advertising. I would encourage my colleagues, if they voted no on the McCollum amendment last year, there are two different amendments that deal with this very same issue. If they voted no on those two amendments, they need to vote no again. Madam Chairman, I would say this again. If you voted no on those two amendments that are structurally the same, vote no again. I would encourage my colleagues to do that, and I yield back the balance of my time.
North Carolina yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Minnesota seek recognition?
To strike the last word on
and the
this amendment.
gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, we just heard from the Speaker that part of what all this money is being spent on is branding and goodwill, and that the Congress and us today should not be making any changes and micromanaging what the National Guard is doing. I would call to our colleagues' attention legislation, Public Law 106-398 in the 106th Congress. The Legislative Information System, which is available to all of us, directs us as to what really took place in the 106th Congress. We directed the Secretary of the Army during a period beginning on October 1st, 2000 and ending December 1st, 2005 to carry out a pilot program to test various recruiting approaches. And one of them was to be an outreach that the Army was going to do with motorsports. It doesn't work, and that's why the Army has dropped it. The National Guard has, through what Mr. Kingston had, didn't come to us directly. We were provided some sponsorship information through NASCAR of all the contacts and all the hits. Everybody who walked through the gate was counted as being part of branding. Folks, this was not supposed to be about branding. It was supposed to be about recruiting. And that's why the Army spokesman on CNN said when they announced that they were ending their 10-year, multi-dollar taxpayer-funded relationship with NASCAR, quote, "It was not a great investment." The Navy pulled out. The Marine Corps pulled out of NASCAR years ago. But yet the Pentagon has paid one racing team, Mr. Earnhardt's team, $136 million in taxpayers' funds for the National Guard logo on his car in the name of recruitment. This year, they're paying Mr. Earnhardt again $26.5 million, to which the National Guard has reported, this is what the Guard told me, 20 qualified candidates expressing interest, zero actual recruits. So over the past 2 years, the National Guard has spent more than $20 million in taxpayers' funds on professional bass fishing tournaments. Folks, we're in a fiscal crisis here. Bass fishing is not a national security. This Congress is cutting services to communities and needy families because we're in a fiscal crisis. Yet the Pentagon is spending in excess of $80 million on NASCAR racing sponsorships, professional bass fishing, ultimate cage fighting, and other sports sponsorships. The program is a waste of taxpayers' money. It doesn't work. Over the past few days, the professional sports lobby has come out in full force to protect their taxpayer-funded subsidy. For the purposes of the 2013 Defense Appropriation Bill, those pro teams are military contractors who have failed to deliver on their contract for the past for the taxpayers for recruits. I want to thank Representative Kingston for his leadership on this and joining me to cut a pennant bond program that's just not effective. This committee in which we're having this bill discussed right now has been bipartisan in the way the bill's been put together and bipartisan in the way this amendment's been offered. If the private sector wants to pool their money to sponsor military race car teams to demonstrate their patriotism, I say fantastic and go for it. But it is my job to be a steward of taxpayers' funds. I want to be clear about something else this amendment does not do. This amendment in no way, shape, or form prohibits or limits military recruiters from recruiting at NASCAR races or any other sports event. I just want the military recruiters to attend those races and community events where there's potential recruits. We need, as Mr. Kingston pointed out, more recruiters doing their job in the right way, and they have ideas, folks, on how we can do this better. We need to listen to the recruiters. So I think it will be just irresponsible and outrageous that Congress would go ahead and continue to borrow money from China to pay for one race car driver's team $26 million for delivering zero recruits. Our nation's facing a fiscal crisis. Communities and families and seniors and vulnerable children are bearing the brunt of deep and painful budget cuts. Congress needs to get its priorities in order and stop protecting military spending that doesn't work. I urge my colleagues to support Mr. Kingston's amendment. It's an honor to be a partner to it. We need to cut the wasteful spending in programs and reduce this deficit. Thank you.
Lady's time's expired. Any other member wish to speak to this amendment? The gentlelady from North Carolina.
Yes, excuse me. I would like to strike the last word.
And the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, like my colleague, Mr. McHenry, I also am rising because I do oppose this amendment and saying that the Department of Defense has to limit what they do and decide how they can recruit. And mainly it's micromanaging. The biggest issue here is this approach is not going to save a dime in the long run, because when recruitment goals aren't met, and that is the challenge, the military pays out nearly $1 billion a year in extra recruitment bonuses to maintain needed recruitment numbers. And we're talking, of course, about the National Guard, who did have a 4-to-1 return on investment in motorsports. But we've got to be aware that we've got to recruit men and women where they are. We need the best men and women that we can in our military service. And, of course, we owe all of those who are currently serving a great debt of gratitude. But I don't believe that we need to tell them how they know best how to do their recruiting. I'm also a conservative, and I believe strongly in rooting out government waste. But that's not what this amendment does, because in the long run, we end up spending more money on recruitment. As my colleague said before, the House has twice voted down this amendment. It's the same vote, and I urge them to do so again. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Any other member wish to speak to this amendment? The gentleman from Mississippi, for what reason does he seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
And the gentleman from Mississippi recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I rise in opposition of this amendment. This past weekend, I had the great honor and privilege to send over 150 young men and women off to Fort Bliss to prepare their final training to go overseas. There's the 857th Engineering Company. Their mission is the horizontal construction, which is pretty much they're going to be clearing roads, and as we know, that's one of the most dangerous missions in Afghanistan. Now, I was too busy shaking hands and talking to families and others to notice what I would probably have seen in the parking lot, and that would have been a lot of bumper stickers. And on those bumper stickers, it wouldn't be faces or political advertisement. Of course, I wish there would be some. But it was more numbers, number 3, number 11, number 24, number 14, and most likely there would have been a few number 88s out there, which is the car Dale Earnhardt drives for NASCAR. So with that, right now is absolutely no reason this Congress should be telling the Department of Defense how and where to spend money on recruitment. Sports sponsorships have continually been a major source of recruitment and provided a great deal of return on investment. The only other option is to spend more on recruitment and retention bonuses. As my colleague just mentioned, when they fall below a certain number, they spend billions of dollars, and we're not talking about billions of dollars. So this actually saves taxpayers money so we can continue to find the young men and women to serve in our nation's military. And as it currently stands, the National Guard cannot advertise on television, which significantly limits their opportunities to reach the audience that they want to reach. This is an effective program that remains a key tool for our National Guard and other branches of our military services. This bill has already taken serious cuts from advertising and marketing budgets for the Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, and National Guard accounts have all been cut significantly already before this amendment. There's no reason why we should continue to tie their hands by cutting more funds from the budget. These sponsorships provide the ability to market and create branding opportunities and familiarity with the service branches in areas where market research shows that the target audience spends its time. For example, data shows that NASCAR fans are very large, up to 70 million. I think that's a low number. Very patriotic, very pro-military fan base, and are extremely loyal to sponsors of teams and drivers. This is exactly who we want joining our U.S. military. Madam Chair, we are currently dealing with very serious cuts to our military because of sequestration. This is not the time or the place to be cutting the tools that our military is using to recruit the very best patriotic young people who want to serve our nation in its military. The military is maximizing their resources to fulfill their mission at home and abroad. If this wasn't successful, they wouldn't be doing it. I ask that my colleagues oppose the amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Any other member wish to speak to this amendment? The gentleman from Georgia.
I move to strike the last word.
And the gentleman from Georgia recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to voice my opposition to the amendment sponsored by Mr. Kingston and Ms. McCollum aimed at banning pro-sports sponsorship by the Department of Defense. Truly, we are in an era where the people's government should take proactive efforts to trim excesses from the budget wherever possible. This measure, Madam Speaker, does not attack an excess of government. If accepted, the U.S. government would be cutting out a proven, successful investment in our nation's military personnel. The Army, the National Guard, the National Guard Association strongly oppose this amendment. Last year, over 280 members of a bipartisan vote opposed this amendment. Appropriations Committee Chairman Rogers, Defense Subcommittee Chairman Young have been both opposed to this measure in committee votes and floor votes. Chairman Young has repeatedly said in 2012 that he opposes it. Our military deserves access to the most qualified potential recruits available. A vote in favor of this amendment would handicap our military's recruiting efforts. Starting in 1999, marketing the military through sports opened the door for the DoD's efforts to brand and to showcase their services to a specific target audience. The National Guard cannot advertise on broadcast television, so professional sports sponsorships becomes an efficient, effective means of reaching target markets for recruiting and retention of citizen soldiers and airmen. Our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are athletes. It only makes sense to advertise and market to professional sports venues. Athletes share common values with the military, such as honor, integrity, individual responsibility, teamwork, and self-sacrifice. Additionally, athletes are a key demographic in the men and women we want to serve. With the DoD's strict requirements for a recruit to qualify, only 1 in every 4 young people is even eligible to join. The DoD's success rate in recruiting stems from their direct access to potential recruits and influencers of men and women like-minded about their interest in joining the military, often found at sporting events. Pro-sports sponsorships increase the DoD's visibility, generate recruitment opportunities at events, and provide a national platform to promote each branch's image. In addition to recruitment and a recognizable national profile, military sponsorships in motorsports spotlight a good return on investment dollar for dollar. In 2011 alone, Army National Guard spent $44 million on motorsports sponsorships, but based on market value, the total media exposure the Guard received totaled over $150 million, a 336% return on investment. If less is spent on advertising, history proves that DoD will have to increase dollars for bonuses to retain current military personnel and increase dollars for recruiting bonuses. DoD motorsports partnerships have resulted in key transfers of technology. For example, the first Humvees sent to Iraq had canvas doors. Additional armor added created challenges to the Humvee suspension systems. The Marines turned to NASCAR engineers to help solve the problem. The additional project developed by the Marines is the Man Roller. Pushed in front of trucks, the roller can detonate explosive devices while protecting the Marines in the vehicle. One of the first rollers in Iraq took a blast and saved the 3 Marines inside. The Man Roller uses new suspension technology developed by the Joe Gibbs NASCAR racing team. Base commanders say that cooperation between base workers and businesses across the country is saving troops' lives. Beyond the direct investment, DoD pro-sponsorships positively influence the communities surrounding our nation's personnel. For example, the National Guard works together with their partners in Panther Racing and IndyCar to address unemployment affecting service members and their families by sponsoring hiring fairs, outreach efforts, and employee education. This amendment would likely limit the military from participating in the Olympics, flyover the games, sponsoring marathons such as the Marine Corps Marathon, as well as the Blue Angels, the Thunderbirds, and the Golden Knights. Cutting all funding towards DoD pro-sports sponsorships hinders military recruitment of qualified candidates, impairs employment resources for our nation's military families, and severely damages our positive financial investment in our military.
The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 2, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Kingston, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Kingston of Georgia.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a recorded vote will rise and remain standing. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
This is that amendment offered by Georgia Republican Jack Kingston. You just heard some of the debate surrounding the proposal to cut $72 million from the Pentagon's sponsorship of sports activities such as NASCAR. 13 more amendment votes, each 2 minutes long, to follow. Earlier today, the House passed a bill requiring President Obama to report to Congress on what would be cut if sequestration goes into effect. Sequestration, cutting more than $1 billion over 10 years, starts in January, and half of those cuts would come from defense, the other half from non-defense discretionary spending. It's part of last year's deal between the President and Congress to raise the federal debt ceiling.
Yeas are 202, the nays are 216. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is on the request for recorded vote by the amendment from the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Quigley of Illinois.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a recorded vote will rise and remain standing. Sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
This amendment, offered by Democrat Mike Quigley, reduces the Navy shipbuilding and conversion account by $988 million, and that includes funding for one DDG-51 destroyer, and then applies the savings to the spending reduction account. There will be more debate and more amendments offered tomorrow. 12 more votes this evening.
The yeas are 60, the nays are 359. On this vote, the yeas are 60, the nays are 359. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on the First Amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
First Amendment offered by Mr. Cohen of Tennessee.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise and remain standing. Sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
This is the first of 2 amendments offered tonight by Tennessee Democrat Steve Cohen. It would reduce the Navy cruiser modernization account by about $506,000 and increase the Defense Health Program specifically for cancer research.
Yeas are 145, the nays are 273. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment offered by the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Pompeo of Kansas.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and remain standing. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device and have 2 minutes to cast their vote.
Kansas Republican Mike Pompeo offered this amendment. It strikes the $250 million Rapid Innovation Fund from the bill and then applies the savings to the spending reduction account. Tomorrow on our Washington Journal, we'll look at military suicide with Mark Thompson of Time magazine. Mr. Thompson's recent cover story in Time examined the suicide rate of U.S. soldiers and the military's response. Washington Journal is live every day on C-SPAN at 7 a.m. Eastern.
137, the nays are 282. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on the First Amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
First Amendment offered by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise and remain standing. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
Massachusetts Democrat Ed Markey's amendment would reduce the funding for ground-based missile defense by $75 million, and it would be applied to the savings in the spending reduction account. More work is ahead tomorrow on the defense spending for 2013. More amendments will be offered. The Senate today worked on a tax cut for multinational companies that move jobs back into the U.S., and a vote to move that bill forward is scheduled for tomorrow at 2:15 p.m. Of course, you can see live Senate action on C-SPAN 2.
The yeas are 150. The nays are 267.
Mr. Ryan of Ohio. Red. Mr. Ryan of Ohio votes no.
On this vote, the yeas are 150, the nays are 268. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Amash, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Amash of Michigan.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a recorded vote will rise and remain standing. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
Michigan Republican Justin Amash offered this amendment. It would allow outsourcing of defense-related work and strike the requirement that it be done on a cost-beneficial basis.
yeas are 166, the nays are 233. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is Chair wishes to announce on the last vote the yeas were 186, the nays are 233. The amendment was not adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on the second amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, on which further proceedings were postponed, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Second amendment offered by Mr. Cohen of Tennessee.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a recorded vote will rise and remain standing. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
And another amendment from Steve Cohen of Tennessee. This amendment would cut funds for building roads and infrastructure in Afghanistan by $175 million.
The yeas are 228, the nays are 191. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise and remain standing. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote.
This amendment, offered by Rhode Island Democrat David Cicilline, would strike $375 million in funding for the Afghanistan Infrastructure Fund and apply that to the savings account. Following tonight's votes in the House, we are going to re-air a House Armed Services Committee hearing from today that looks at the evaluation and the impact of sequestration on the Department of Defense. Sequestration, of course, refers to the cutting of $1 billion starting in January. Half of those budget cuts will come from the Defense Department.
The nays are 271.